The Mega Man franchise is a bit of a prolific one, consisting of mainly running and gunning 2D platformers, and over time has left its own respectable mark on the larger gaming sphere as a whole. Some of its series such as the Mega Man X and Mega Man Zero lines of games were ones that strove to deliver fast and Twitch reaction focused gameplay, alongside having a laundry list of other supplemental character progression systems, frenetic nature, and very flexible controls to help them be a very unique mix of gameplay elements when compared to most other platformers, and thus forming their own respective cult followings. And this is where Gravity Circuit comes in. In spite of the aforementioned series that have a wide catalog of titles to try, very few other games that aren't under the Mega Man branding have tried to capture the same magic. Since 2010, there's been a single mainline title that wasn't a spin-off, and putting collections of old games aside, the franchise has been near silent since Mega Man 11 in 2017, and thus, thanks to such a drought in content, this game seizes the chance to cater to the crowd, particularly those more familiar with the titles that lean to a speed demon and combat focus more than something methodical, while doing enough to set itself apart from its very clear influences and inspirations, although its originality in regards to level makeup, namely the enemies, is lacking. It has most things people like about the X and Zero series, while being streamlined, focused, and even more fluid than before. It also covers most of its bases by having features for speedrunners, those wanting very flexible control schemes and button mappings, or those seeking additional replay value, so players will have little to complain about if they have remotely any investment in this type of game. And there's much reason to be invested, because the changes here to the traditional formula we've seen done countless times before are mostly for the better. They serve to change up the same old and also shed much of the fat gameplay systems had, so that they're now much more easily understood and interacted with. Besides the huge expansion in viewable distance so past camera issues are near non-existent, dashing has been changed to a run state you can toggle in and out of, alongside an assorted list of EX moves in the place of traditional special weapons, and here they're resource dependent unlike many of the ones in the Zero series, so resource management still has a proper place in this game. The chain rod from Zero 2 sees new life here with a complete overhaul, so now it's a combat and movement option, but made actually practical, not a laughably bad tool to fiddle around with. In Zero 2 had way too many moments of causing anxiety when just trying to make simple swings across gaps barely wider than a standard dash jump, and that alone speaks volumes. The numerous problems with the original chain rod hampered gameplay needlessly, and they were way past the line of quirks in place for the sake of balance. The amount of missing potential in the original incarnation is well realized here, alongside being something that receives added combat depth with how it's your main tool for launching enemies and projectiles, sometimes giving really satisfying feedback when dispatching different enemies via tossing exploding corpses around. It can also still be used as a safe, long-distance poke for any times you need to exercise extra caution, even if it's no long-range buster. The difference is night and day, and it's like going from a water toy pistol to the real thing. Extra side objectives to do during stages are here too, with how power-ups and rescues are still present, but now with a much more spread out and focused inclusion. Every stage of the main 8 has 8 robots, a paint chip, and a life or energy tank to get, so there's no big imbalance with stage collectible amounts or how valuable they are. And better yet, no needless, overabundant placements of rescues that won't contribute to anything, and there's also no worry about a lack of distinction between the filler and important ones. Most times you come across rescuable robots, they'll be tied to their own separate platforming challenges that branch from the main level structure, so the fun ways of obtaining capsules, tanks, or cyber elves is still intact and stimulating. And that's not all. In past games you had at least some collectibles that required specific upgrades or weapons to obtain. In this game, anything can be obtained, at any time. Anything. There's no need to worry about having a least backtracking route to decipher by mapping out a long level route of what should be played before what, or being needlessly locked out of collectibles just because you don't have the right weapon or ability to get them, with the worst being behind tedious backtracking or really vague and nonsensical solutions that don't test player knowledge or clever experimentation. All that's required is having a keen eye for breakable blocks or some suspicious looking gaps. Some of the magic there was of figuring out multiple solutions has been lost, as most of the collectibles are fairly one-note, and really just rely on using your base tools and awareness to get instead, but the unhampered routing more than makes up for it. Routing aside, There's no shop to abuse for items or upgrades that cost an exuberant amount of money to get. Currency is instead for armor paints, additional EX moves, body chips, and a glossary. The currency is balanced to the point that you won't need to heavily grind to unlock anything you would really want. At most you should need a few stage revisits if you cleared all stages at least once, and you make an effort to get most of the currency you come across. Most things are reasonably priced, and the glossary prices can be saved until you buy all upgrades first. You'll be spending most of your currency in the hub that's reminiscent of the ones in the Zero series, but particularly the one in 04, given here it's all really compact, and now with almost anything you'd want in a hub. There's the ones for different character augmentations, the one responsible for the glossary of different NPCs, enemies and bosses, a place to mess around with your moves before heading into missions, a room dedicated just for boss refights, and even one to play basketball in. Even still, there's a couple of other nuances with the level design and general gameplay that were done so that the laser-focused design shines through this game's quality and accessibility, which were in the service of making playthroughs all the more digestible. A few more changes include how pits and spikes no longer instantly kill, and even won't do damage if you get hurt by them while you have active invincibility frames. So you still have a high punishment for failing some platforming sections, but without an exceedingly high amount of stress to deal with. There's also how health pickups are fairly scant. Most stages have a few health pickups for their entire length, with more focus going towards checkpoints that double as full restore stations. Lives have also been removed entirely, and so have sub-tanks as a form of on-command ammo and health restoration, but the game is perfectly reasonable to tackle in spite of their removals. It focuses on the moment-to-moment action rather than the all-too-common practice of keeping elements that limit how many tries are available towards completing a stage for the sake of tradition. The general level structure meanwhile manages to be similar to the series it's inspired by, although a specific part of its shared blood is frankly what holds this game back the most by a wide margin. In terms of fairness and using the assets it has available, this collection of levels is actually some of the best in its genre. Anything that was introduced or presented never got forgotten about way too quickly. The developers managed to realize much of the potential of what they could do, and the setups using enemies and gimmicks kept being recontextualized often, while having enough variety and thought put into them so that flexing the base moveset was constantly incentivized and rewarded appropriately. It's an interesting case where I can't really fault the execution of the assets per se, but rather the cast of enemies being so exceedingly mediocre and warranting a disregarding shrug. So closely mimicking the X and Zero series brought about a lack of identity in this department, so much so that on a closer inspection there's a fair amount of enemies that are basically copies from past games with minimal visual changes, and the connections aren't far-reaching either. It's not necessarily something I can blame them for doing, because the amount of enemies to possibly reference, or straight up transfer, is fairly daunting if you account for all the different titles. With so much different source material already made, it was going to be harder to be original, but at the very least they could have stood to have used some of the more interesting enemies as a form of compromise, or plainly introducing even more than they already have. If the quantity was a good amount higher than it is currently, you'd at least have some novelty with having a really fat list. The enemy roster, while not being on the smaller scale, also shows a very clear uniformity between enemies within this game in a vacuum too, which isn't hard to notice. Most of the cast consists of a base idea, be it a wall turret, a humanoid enemy carrying a weapon, a quick and short robot that travels exclusively on one section of a surface, a small flying enemy that shoots, a stocky and short robot that launches projectiles, etc. Then that base idea has a single property changed, which while it does come with a visual redesign for each as well, still shows a lack of meaningful variety. Even if many of the ideas this shares with the other titles were completely original and belonged exclusively to this game, I wouldn't call most of these interesting either. I guess the inspiration didn't strike them for the enemy roster nearly as much as it should have. I do need to say that while playing I didn't feel annoyed at having so many goons being standard, or that it was something that really detracted from my experience. It just feels what could have been easily improved the most when taking everything into account. It isn't all bad though, as the end stages managed to be surprisingly good, although this is partly in contrast to what's come before. The final levels are amusingly better than effectively every Mega Man title in spite the lack of originality, as too often end stages in those games brought back little to no gimmicks or enemies from their full rosters, relying on too small of a pool while also introducing very little that's new or interesting, being outright boring, or being too short. This game meanwhile has nearly all of its past ideas you've dealt with come back at some point for all of the end stage runtime, really putting forth a good test of what you've learned up until now. The game trusts players that they'll be able to handle these new and really tricky setups, testing knowledge of gimmicks whilst time isn't spent trying to introduce them first in a safer environment. The general lack of originality is the biggest missed opportunity that this game didn't capitalize on to help elevate it to true greatness status. But the boss fights by contrast manage to be their own thing completely, as they're also one of this game's most fun aspects. Unlike many of the level design ideas, the bosses here are for all intents and purposes original, and don't take heavy notes from past titles as a basis. The similarities that can be found with them here are much rarer or heavily mixed. They're pretty inspired, while also having a near universal high bar of quality thanks to how well they're designed. They follow a general structure of having a wide range of attacks that they cycle through at random, while most also sport a desperation phase of sorts to up the tension, and also having gimmicks shown throughout the stages active during their fights to make them more interesting. It's something most fights in past Mega Man titles rarely did, if they even changed the room layouts from a flat surface that is. It's definitely worth noting though that some of these can be bent to your will too easily, depending on how you go about using your EX moves. About half the bosses have an oversight where they can go into a tumble state you can pummel away at, while they helplessly flail around, letting you take a good chunk of health for a somewhat minimal commitment. When you land even your basic flying strike while they're not invincible, they'll be thrown out of an attack animation for a couple of seconds, which can also stop some attacks from starting or continuing. Landing an EX move is also far from difficult most of the time, as the combat of this game relies on you getting so up close in the first place, and it more or less gives you a weakness available to use on some bosses if you have the meter to spend. Trying to stack damage quickly by numerous EX moves one after the other or by pummeling enough eventually triggers iframes for bosses so that they're not completely helpless, but it activates too late to stop some mild brute forcing from happening. If they went invincible right after you landed a single EX move, I think that would be enough, though some EX move damage output might also need some tweaking. Special mention goes to how the boss rush for this game is done in an actually interesting way, however. It's still a gauntlet to go through, but at long last it's had some serious overhauling done to make it way less of a hassle, and no longer something I dread doing for any future playthroughs. It's not only random as to which refight you'll be doing, but it also has a crystal robot that changes between each refight for added content, has each refight with the circuits start them at half their health, and progress gets saved after every circuit beaten, so it's not automatically a needlessly major cliff in difficulty or time spent in one session. Doing it this way severely lessens the blow of potentially thinking this game is lazy for reusing content, and I actually found it a joy to play through. My time felt respected instead of being lazily inflated. It's even separate from the stage with the final boss, a blessing compared to some of the worst moments in the past games that consisted of going through the entire boss rush and the final boss on the same set of lives. Yet another smart decision that happened was with the presentation, namely with the graphics. Visually, this game had admirable aims to try and stand out from the rest of its contemporaries as a small budget indie title with the color choices, as everything in this game has a pretty limited color palette they applied universally. Menus, characters, backgrounds, and tile sets all had their respective colors limited to 1 or 2 at a time, then that color being made lighter or darker as a supplement. Plain white, grey, or black then usually serve as a heavy contrast for color balancing and clarity. This results in something quite unique from the overabundant sprite-based games of similar or lesser resolution out there today, even if they didn't have the resources at hand to break completely free from sprite sizes this small. This is probably close to the best they could have managed, and the limitations on color don't make this game look boring or cheap, but instead really unique and bold. At times the art style choice results in a few moments of subpar clarity, like cracked walls that won't be easily discerned from the rest until a closer inspection or second look is given. It's hard to say if this falls more on the color choices or the resolution, and it'll be aggravated if someone is playing a good distance away from the screen like on a TV in a living room. After playing through the game 3 times, I still ended up missing a few rescues even when I made sure to keep my eyes peeled and knew where most of them were. These moments are thankfully few and far between though. I would be remiss, however, to not strike the game where it's fair. Besides the few moments where I had to revisit a few stages for some remaining rescues, The hub has a bad issue that effectively hides the training dummy, and, much more egregiously, the boss refight room. There's an off-screen platform that you need to use the chain to reach, although the small, skinny strips of blue platform here are also something that have collisions, which really doesn't look like they do. They match very similarly to those other parts of machinery here that aren't interactive, and I think I wouldn't have known about there being a quick option to refight bosses in this game for a while if I hadn't been told about it when I first played. I really don't see why you couldn't have moved the great platform down to be in this room below instead. The music hits similarly notable highs to the presentation, even if it took a while to grow on me. Dominic Nimmark's compositions here are fairly similar to the ones he did for Mega Man X Corrupted, although straying away from the Super Nintendo-esque style that game has. It's usually high energy techno, with a high emphasis on bass and a fast BPM to really get you going when it needs to, even if some of the results aren't awfully memorable. Where it manages to succeed the most is when the action is at a climax, particularly with the boss fight themes or the highway stage, perfectly supplementing the quick weaving and vaulting through obstacles as you go to ride jetboards and get assaulted by waves of missiles you need to precisely avoid. Kai is the one coming to the rescue here, and the music makes sure to put on a very heroic vibe to complement that. This soundtrack also has plenty of music to keep one occupied, as every circuit intro sports their own track, while there's also more than your average amount of cutscene and boss music to fill one's ears. This game has managed to remedy many of the issues that plagued almost all of the parental titles it pays homage to, ranging from making many gameplay aspects much more streamlined, to actually knowing what to do with the narrative, alongside providing almost any quality of life addition one can think of. They managed to fix almost any qualms I might have had if I played this game at launch, as over time they put out numerous free updates to make the original game even better, which is also such a big rarity in the gaming landscape. They still want this game to be the best it can be, but aren't charging a cent for it, even if I'm sure DLC would sell pretty well and also be generously priced regardless. And yet, they've also added game modifiers that change boss fights to have new attacks, make enemies act differently and more aggressively, and also heavily revamp levels as just 3 of the total changes some updates have brought. The updates page on Steam is just chock full of unnecessary and amusing tidbits of the game's cast of characters and lore they came up with, alongside many development notes, sources for inspirations, and a big amount of fan-submitted questions they've answered. It even goes as far as to have an entire post solely concerning the game's soundtrack. Most major studio titles don't even share half the amount of fulfilling and lengthy posts truly drenched and oozing with passion as the ones for Gravity Circuit. And yet, even as of publishing this video, nearly a year after its original release, it's still getting even more updates that are fixing bugs or tweaking different things for the sake of balance and polish. At this rate, perhaps the still unpublished level editor can still be finished, although that's yet to be determined. As far as I'm concerned, if this were an official Rockman title, it would effortlessly be placed on the same pedestal that the rest of the best reside on. If the main games had consistently lived up to their potential, I think I would still say this game is worthy of being a very solid homage to all of its inspirations.